Parev says, does anyone understand what I just said? Oh, I was feeling so inspired by the celebration of the microcosm of diversity in this room that I had to share. I'm going to kick off with a personal story. I'm ethnically Armenian. And I hadn't thought about this characteristic that I'm going to share with you now. I'm actually a child of an undocumented immigrant who had a path to citizenship when he came to this country. And I was the first college graduate. So I was inspired, again, by what I heard earlier today, and these are the beacons of hope, I think, that make America, continue to make America a special place, and a place for economic opportunity for all. So the words honor and being humbled have been used many times. I'm honored and humbled for probably little different reasons in being part of the forum today. I work quite a bit in interdisciplinary circles, but rarely through diverse sectors. And I appreciate the diverse sectors that have been brought in to talk about the perspective of race and poverty. I'm an economist. Sometimes when I say that, people want to hide under chairs or run away. So I hope my personal anecdote meant that you kind of maybe like me a little bit, just a little bit. I'm up here. I am a producer of research. I'm a producer of research that provides evidence, and evidence for policymaking. And my career path has been very driven by producing that high-level evidence, the kind that people can use in congressional testimony. I'm not going to bombard you with all of that, but that's sort of what I do. So today I wanted to give you some context. It has some interesting overlaps in ways that weren't planned with the conversations this morning, but I think it points out to the common ground and the things we're worried about today and the things we want to think about harder moving forward. And then my research will be peppered in some of the things I'm talking about. They won't kind of talk you through the design stage to the research protocols and such, but I'm happy, as always, to talk about that in more detail offline, or come see me. I'm right down there. All right, so. Okay, I have 4 main points of today's remarks. One is that the child poverty rate in the US remains stubbornly high since the days when it was first developed as a threshold, as a measure for tracking poverty, which was in the 1960s by a woman named Molly Orshansky. And over time, it's been increasingly composed of non-white children. My second point is being raised poor has a variety of negative impacts on children's development, including the likelihood of being income poor as an adult or parent. The poverty experience in the US is so not one size fits all. It's actually become, I think, increasingly heterogeneous in the last decade, and I'm going to point to some ways that we need to think hard about that. It has huge implications for how we design policy and programs. And then finally, public policy efforts to reduce poverty have had some success. The success has been quite mixed. Are we paying attention to the right things? And that's sort of the question you can keep posing to yourself as I throw lots of statistics and facts out to you. I'm realizing, because I'm going blind, I have to wear my glasses. Okay. So this was mentioned earlier today. I'm going to give you the fact. It was mentioned that child poverty in the US is actually remarkably high, even in a global context. We are an economically rich country, but we don't score so well when it comes compared to other countries. And so what you see here to your right is the US actually has the 7th highest poverty rate, higher than the average for the countries that fall under the Organization of Economic Cooperation. The other thing to note from this chart is that the circle is an indication of children in poverty as compared to the bar, which is the total population. You see that we score not so well when we look at the total population. We score super, super poorly when it comes to child poverty. Okay. So what does this look like in the US? And I'm actually going to put all the lines up here. Okay. So you'll see here there's intention behind the tracking. So when you see the beginning of this trend and series, that's because that's the reality of data collection. This is when the poverty measure was first constructed. And you can see from this trend when we started paying attention to race and ethnicity, right? When we started asking those questions in the census data in the late 1970s. And then there's the third point. So the black line is US child poverty overall over time. You see it started off pretty high when this measure was first developed. It's been pretty steady through some remarkable times in the US. So going back to a point made earlier, some of the things that we're facing right now are not new, right? But some things have shifted, and this goes back to the point of heterogeneity of poor children. So if your eye goes naturally up to the trend lines that are up top, they are characterized by two things, race and ethnicity, right? So we have black children in the blue line and Hispanic children in the red line with sort of the black dots. And the story of you see the white child poverty is much lower. It's actually below the dark black line. So this is a gap. This is a gap that's been shown in a few slides today. And actually, to be honest, I could take out these trend lines that are child poverty, and I could put in education. I could put in maybe experiences of crime. I can put in literacy. I can put in so many other outcomes, and you will see a very similar type of trend line, right? So consistently, children of African American or black families are going to perform the worst. And children of white families are going to perform the best, and Hispanic children are always in the middle, okay? And from the day that we could track these data, that's the trend lines that you're going to see. There's something else that's been going on in America that's relatively recent, and I want to sort of give a nod to my colleague, Catherine Eden. If you don't have her book, I encourage you to get it. She is a sociologist that has done a lot of very deep, qualitative, structured interviews with low-income families. And her recent book with Luke Schaefer called $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America, started, as many of us might start in working in this field, with a story. And this was when she was speaking to one of the families that she was interviewing and realizing that this family was relying on no formal sources of income. No government income, no earned income, no child support income. How in the world were they surviving? This inspired a question to herself: how many people in this country are living under these circumstances? And so she went to her colleague Luke Schaefer, who ran some numbers in a national data set, and lo and behold, they uncovered some striking numbers. So this has been sort of tagged as extreme poverty in America, which is one way to look at it. I think we probably always had extreme poverty. The difference here is what it looks like. These are people that are disconnected, for the most part, from any, let's call, formal institution or formal source of support. Importantly, the timing of this phenomena has happened as the social safety net has unraveled in our country and become increasingly conditioned on employment, which has also become very precarious in the last decade. Okay, so they discovered that the number of American families living on $2 per person per day has skyrocketed to 1.5 million American households, including about 3 million children. They learned that families are surviving by hustling for cash, and I guess you could call it innovative ways, donating plasma, donating anything that they can that actually exists on their body, illegal trafficking of food stamp benefits, setting up pop-up sort of trades in goods and services in their homes. So to give you some more context on those numbers, here's another chart. This is children in extreme poverty. I'm not trying to trick you. I was just trying to think about, I think two sets of numbers are interesting and important. One is the proportion of children overall in any one racial or ethnic group, where you can say things like 1 out of 3 children in this group are experiencing X, but also the total number of children. Like, what numbers are we talking about, right? 1 out of 3 could mean there's 30, or 1 out of 3 could mean there's 3 million. And so this gives you a picture of both of those statistics, right? And so here you see a similar story. The highest proportion of children living in extreme poverty in America, in the most recent data, are black, and it's 2.0 million black children. And then it's 2.1 million Hispanic children, proportionally a little lower, but still a lot of children. And this, if you add those two, that's 4 million. Let's call them non-white children, which is double the size of white children, okay? Which we still care about, So this is extreme poverty, $2 a day. Here's a sense of where these children are living. The importance of place came up before lunch. Place, in addition to having possibly quite negative influences on life quality and health, also has a series of other spiraling effects, and can often, the thing that is interesting here is it's quite clustered, right? The geographical experience of where you live in America can be quite pronounced depending on where you live in America. So the extreme poverty is happening for African American children or black children. You can see here sort of in the Midwest, a little bit in the Southeast. It's very different than where the pockets of extreme poverty are happening for Hispanic children. Okay, so if your hat is in the world of place-based strategies, and you're saying to yourself, I want to address poverty, and I'm really concerned about black poverty, it matters, right? This kind of map really matters about where you might be investing your dollars and thinking about solutions. So worldwide poverty and where the US situates itself, what's happening with US poverty and trends over time, this new phenomenon called extreme poverty, where families with children are disconnected from a lot of our formal sources of income. And there's another element here that's been increasing over time. It's called concentrated poverty, and this goes back to the sense of place. So concentrated poverty conventionally is census tracts with poverty rates of greater than 20%. 58% of all poor children live in high poverty areas. There are two ways you can look at this. One is majority of poor children are living in places that are extremely poor. You can also think about there's a substantial minority of poor children that are not living in places that are poor, right? So I'm giving you sort of one framing of this. Blacks and Hispanics account for larger shares of those who live in high poverty areas and their shares of the general population compared to whites and non-Hispanics. So here are, again, some statistics. Children living in areas of concentrated poverty by race, ethnicity. The orange and the blue bars represent black and Hispanic children, so that's a total of about 8 million children. They're living in these high poverty areas, which is substantially higher than white children. Poverty has many implications for children. The talk this morning showed from the health perspective the correlates of poor health. There's some overlap here, unsurprisingly, in the correlates of poverty. Aspects of children's household associated with poverty that we have found in the literature over the prior decades: low parental education, un- or underemployment of adults or parents in the household, a new phenomena, low, unstable, or unpredictable earnings among employed adults in the household, single parenthood, poor psychosocial or physical health, higher rates of domestic and substance abuse, unsafe neighborhoods, higher rates of material hardship. And here I'm sort of combining low quality housing, missed bill payments. What it means, so research has produced all these interesting correlations, and there might be some people in the audience that look at this and say, okay, here is the solution I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on parental education because I think that's the thing that matters. What these correlates also inspire, though, is debate, and I will take full blame. It's usually the economists. And what's the debate? So is it poverty that's causing, or actually, I'll use the word causing, these negative effects on children's development, or is it these other things that seem to be highly associated with poverty? And this is where research, I think, is extremely important. How much can we unpack the relative root causes? And so what this provokes is debate, and sometimes when we get a little stuck in what to do, it's often because the debates get hijacked by people who are highly influential. So here is sort of a sprinkling of what those debates look like. You hear commentaries like, it's not poverty, it's low expectations. We've heard about the culture kind of explanation. It's hopelessness, it's thrift, it's culture. Robert Rector of the Heritage Foundation at one point declared that marriage remains America's strongest anti-poverty weapon, and some of you might remember that the Federal Administration for Children and Families had to take this on full force, and literally converted their poverty research agenda into a marriage and relationship agenda. So that's exactly when I left MDRC, actually, because I couldn't subscribe to that. And it's very interesting today. We've got all these results showing that these marriage and relationship programs, guess what, are not the magic bullet, but now we have some real evidence to be able to counter that debate. So again, the importance of investing in evidence, even though it takes a long time, it transcends a lot of the political flavor of the day, let's say. So methodologically, there's also claims that higher income is consistently found to benefit children's development, particularly when poverty is experienced early in life, but this is not accurate, let alone fair. Summary of the literature. And I'm just giving you some, this is published literature, mostly economists. So we're not at a point in time where we can conclude that money matters. So what is the evidence? I think the evidence is actually pretty good. There's some very open questions. If I have time, I can talk about one study that we're trying to launch a big social experiment to help answer one of those questions. Research generally, consistently points to positive effects of increased income, especially during early periods of children's development. This has first been born out of a whole host of descriptive social science studies, but there's also a body of pretty convincing evidence from what I would call causal studies. So these are studies that can methodologically pull out the effects of income from all those other factors that I just told you about that are highly correlated with poverty. These come from the days of the 1970s, when there was something called the negative income tax experiments, and bubble through time with researchers sort of taking advantage of these conditions in America that meant some people and some children got some policy or package bundle that generated income, and then observationally equivalent people and families didn't get the bundle and therefore did not experience this increase in income. And if people who cared about children were around when those studies were launching, it was an opportunity to include measures of children's development to be able to say something. And I was very fortunate to be part of some of these experiments. In the 1990s, the welfare reform experiment, so this was under Clinton. One of the benefits of devolution, meaning that federal policy and the decisions around federal policy got transferred to the states and localities, was that states had to experiment and they had to have some research with whatever they were implementing. One of those states was Minnesota. I spent a lot of time there. And Minnesota did something that seemed radical at the time, which was in the old days, it used to be called AFDC. When you worked, every dollar you earned outside was traded for $1 of AFDC. So of course, it didn't really make sense, right, to work. And so Minnesota did something radical, which was, we'll let you keep some of your benefits even while your earnings are increasing up to some level. And what we found, and this was done through an experiment, and we found that this effect of increased income had tons of spiraling effects on family well-being, from reductions in domestic abuse to improvements in children's developmental outcomes, both in their academic and cognitive outcomes and in their social behavioral outcomes. Maybe a little bit of health. I have to say health, children's measures of health have not moved very much in the context of these income studies. There's also new exciting research that I think is sort of cracking open openness to this topic. For some reason, what happens with the brain is sort of very amenable to kind of selling this work. We're all really fascinated with what's going on with neurons and development of neurons. So new collaborations are happening between social scientists and neuroscientists, and taking what they're doing in the lab with measuring early brain development and trying to understand how that reacts to different social contexts. And some of that early work is showing some striking differences in how children's early brains are developing in response to their economic environment. And so this gives sort of another lever for thinking about why poverty policy and income security could be so important. The brain is developing so fast and is so sensitive and very difficult to reverse that kind of development early in childhood later on. So it does have a lot more sort of power and leverage than thinking about, high school graduation. So I'm going to turn a little bit to what I mentioned earlier about the heterogeneity of the poverty experience, increasingly so in the US in the last decade. I, along with some other researchers, have been thinking a lot about this concept of stability. I was thrilled to see economic stability on a slide earlier today. It's not something that was featured front and center, let's say 15 years ago. Now it is. This idea that families are living month to month, paycheck to paycheck, if they have a paycheck, versus chronic poverty. The other dimension of poverty experience that I hinted to in the context of extreme poverty is, where is income coming from? How much do we rely on others, the government, or the labor market? Third, what is the availability of financial cushions? There was a lot of focus this morning about health insurance, or at least it was one component of the conversation. We should think more broadly. There are a lot of catastrophic events that can happen in one's life that are easy spirals into poverty and poverty traps, i.e. difficult to get out of. Health insurance is certainly one of them. Medical expenses and medical debt is one of the most common sources of debt that low-income families talk about. But there's other things about your home, about your car, about disability that should be part of the conversation. The other aspect of this is access to credit and low-cost credit. Right? A lot of the debt that low-income families accumulate is because they have no options, so they go for the really expensive options, like payday loans, let's say, that have very high interest rates. And while they might be a solution to a short-term solution to an emergency, they actually are, they actually can set one on a path to a poor, longer-term economic path. And here, along these dimensions, there is a lot of variation by race and ethnicity, strikingly so, more so in the last decade. And I'm going to just sort of touch on a few of them. So a lot of this work has been informed with the collaboration I'm part of, the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families. I was really struck by, there's a lot of very good focus on black-white differences. The Hispanic black-white differences are just now emerging as something important. The picture of poverty in America is becoming increasingly a picture of Hispanic poverty and likely to continue as a picture of Hispanic poverty. And we know so little about those families and the economic circumstances of their families. The work of this center is in part, I think surprisingly for us, try to sort of uncover some indicators of what the lives of Hispanic children look like. And it's very different than black and white children. So I encourage you to take a look at the center. It is a hub for research as well as fellows and dissemination and building capacity more generally to do work in this area. So this is a picture, I should say the other, as a side note, one reason why we can really focus on Hispanic children now, which is related to their growing population, is that they're increasingly represented in our big data sets. So we have enough information on them now that we can actually pull them out and really look at them as a group, and we can really do this for the last decade. And that's sort of what I've been doing with these big national data sets. So here's a picture of children in Hispanic households across different income quintiles. And this is looking at yet another issue related to income inequality. And so what you see, the 20% line, if it were true that Hispanic children as compared to the non-Hispanic peers were equivalently, if you care about distribution, more of an equity perspective, right? If it were true that there was equitable distribution of resources, then you would expect all these bars to be at about the 20% black line. And that's not what you see. Right? You see a real skewing of children in non-Hispanic households to the right at the highest income quintiles, and a real distorted skewing of children in Hispanic households to the left. This hasn't shifted very much. This is a picture from 2004 to 2006. The data, it's like an odd period, but the reason why it is that period, it's pre-recession, and these data really allow you to look at monthly income. So you can get much deeper than sort of a recall of last year's income. If you look at this post-recession, something equally interesting happens. So what happens with the low income comparisons is basically the same. Hispanic children are much more likely to be in the lowest income quintiles versus non-Hispanic. And then you see this disturbing shift, right? So you're no longer seeing even the meager 9% of children, Hispanic children in the highest income quintiles are moving down. And so that suggests some impediments, right, to economic mobility that are continuing to shift this distribution at least to the middle, if not to the lowest income. So I'm interested in this question of stability of income. Chaos in income can provoke chaos in other aspects of children's lives. It came up in the context of health. It can affect routines. It can affect whether children are showing up to preschool every day. It can affect showing up for a doctor's appointment in lots of ways. The stress it provides, or the stress that it causes in thinking, as well as the day-to-day actual what you're doing stress. So this is a measure of income instability. I was curious to see what children of low-income Hispanic households might look like if we were to ask ourselves, well, are they living in economically stable households? And how does that look different for Hispanic children as compared to children of other racial ethnic groups? And this had another interesting result, which is, well, first of all, you'll see the bars on the left are much higher. So not surprising that children growing up in low-income households in general are also growing up in low and unstable income households than children who are living in higher income. So they have higher income and more stable, right, income. But children in Hispanic households have a little bit of a possible advantage here. The income that they're growing up with might be very low, but it's stable. I can't answer the question about whether it's predictable, but I can tell you one thing about it that's interesting. And that is it has to do with earnings. So children in Hispanic households are much more likely to be living with at least one adult earner, and earnings are coming in. Not necessarily from the formal labor market, but earnings are coming in. On average, they tend to be stable for the household. So these black bars are variation, and that's very different, especially from children in black households. So compared with their income-poor non-Hispanic white peers, children in black households, I haven't showed you all these statistics. I was trying to kind of pull out things that would be interesting to you and hopefully can contribute to the conversation. So children in black households have much higher rates of social assistance. They are much more likely to be residing with a single parent and much more likely to have an absent father. Children in Hispanic households, and this is same income, right, from our metrics, the data that we have available to kind of sort children in different income categories. In contrast, children in Hispanic households reside with at least one adult earner, more likely. They're much more likely to be residing with two parents. So, you look at those two characteristics and you think, well, here's some real resources available to children in Hispanic households that we might be able to capitalize on, at least from a program or policy perspective. But they do have one characteristic that could be quite a detriment. They're also more likely to be residing with at least one undocumented parent. Where that goes remains to be seen, but it's certainly true. It's something like 1 out of 4 low-income Hispanic children. So I'm going to switch gears to the last point on my slide and talk a little bit about poverty and social policy. These are my claims. These are not anything that's shown formally in science, but I wanted to say that there are 3 areas I think to pay attention to when we're thinking about poverty policy. One is federal expenditures and the way that that's dispersed. Is it happening at the federal level? Is it happening at the local or state level? The authorities who have control over the money matters, and the amount that's available to spend matters. How program and policies interface and sometimes compete with family needs. So this is thinking hard about how is it dispersed? What is the timing? Is it contingent on ages of children? What are the characteristics of families that matter? And then third, getting under the hood on implementation and practice. And so one thing recently that I've been thinking a lot about as an economist is all the assumptions we make, going back to the if you build them, will they come? Challenge that was stated this morning, and usually they don't. And certainly the one-stop health centers is very novel behaviorally, or behavioral economically, I should say. But we don't think hard about all these sort of small, important decisions that we ask people to make or to assess so that they can actually take advantage and benefit from a lot of the programs and policies available to them. And so thinking about all those micro decisions and how to design around those decisions has become an increasingly interesting part of my work. And this is really thinking about existing programs rather than thinking about how to expand programs. Okay, so let's talk about expenditure. This is a chart pulled from colleagues Julia Isaacs at the Urban Institute. So the 10 biggest spending and tax programs that go to children in 2015. I'd be happy to see Medicaid is way up there. It's a huge support for children. Next in line is the Earned Income Tax Credit, which has had remarkable nonpartisan support and has expanded tremendously. But here's the problem with it. You can't get the Earned Income Tax Credit unless you're working. And so you know where that's going. So it is an enormous cash infusions of $4,000 to $5,000 to $6,000, often allocated as a lump sum around tax time, but only if you have some proof of work. And then you'll see, a variety of other sort of tax-related versus direct outlays to children. The one that I really am interested in, I think piques everyone's interest recently in America, is the role of food stamps and how food stamps has become our social safety net in this country. It has become a replacement for the unraveling of cash assistance. And so it's fifth in line here. It provides essential food security, of course, but as I mentioned before, it's become kind of this currency, this cash currency for families. So I want to be honest, there's some debate in the literature, again, mostly economists, about how we think about child poverty and whether it has remained stubbornly high and whether our policies have indeed chipped away at and reducing child poverty. So you can make lots of adjustments to the poverty measure. And you can see here with these adjustments that include things like receipt of benefits, which is not included usually when you count children in poverty. If you make assumptions about who's in the household and who might be contributing to income in the household, and you make some assumptions about health benefits, you can see how far we can get, right? The poverty rate in these colors gets lower and lower and lower with each assumption. So here's what I would say about this chart. I believe it. It's probably true. And it gives us some ammunition or some things we can aspire to achieve. I don't think it's a real picture of what's happening. And this goes back to this point about our assumptions. It assumes that whoever you're cohabiting with is actually making money and contributing money. It assumes that if there is something like a food stamp program, that the family's receiving it consistently. So can we tackle child poverty? For sure. Do we have knowledge about how to do that from a policy perspective? Definitely. We have a lot of work to do about that interaction of how to implement it and make sure families are getting it. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about I don't know, maybe it's considered boring work. For me, it's really interesting work. So I'm thinking a lot about social assistance benefits and its impacts on schooling outcomes. So the world of educational settings and inequalities in educational outcomes has rightly focused a lot on educational environments, right? How do we invest in schools? How do we pay teachers more? How do we change the quality of the school climate? And largely does not consider what's happening in the home and the resources in the home. And so that's sort of the world that I like to think about, what's happening with the family and how that intersects with other settings and programs and policies. So we had this interesting question about instability and the month-to-month kind of living paycheck to paycheck, and whether this has implications for what and how children are behaving in school. And so you can think about attendance, you can think about other extreme aspects of behavior like disciplinary events, and that's what we had data for. So this is looking at all public school students in Chicago. And it's the incident of being reported for some kind of negative disciplinary event, pretty harsh. So this isn't like you violated a dress code. This is something more extreme than that. And what our hypothesis was, if families are really struggling month to month, and you only get your monthly income benefit one time in the month, then at the end of the month, you should be running out of money, and things should be very stressed in the household. And this might be borne out by seeing children acting out in school, right? And so our hypothesis was we should be seeing more disciplinary events happening at the end of the month than at the beginning of the month. And we do. So I'm doing a lot of hand waving on methodology that we used. But what you should see here, there are a couple of interesting things. One is that disciplinary events, right? We had daily data on disciplinary events. So this is over an academic year. It's very choppy. It's choppy for the students who are not receiving food stamps and for the students who are receiving food stamps. But it's choppy in a different way for the students who are receiving food stamps and in a way that's sort of consistent with our hypothesis. So these peaks are more escalated where you see the arrows at the end of the month. Okay, so we found some evidence of this. We actually didn't find this population is exclusively Black and Hispanic, right? There are hardly any whites in Chicago public schools. We didn't find any differences between Blacks and Hispanics in this analysis. We saw a little bit more of a pronounced effect amongst the males than females. So one more thing I wanted to talk about before I kind of wrap up in terms of filling gaps in our policy. One thing that we haven't tackled head on is thinking about families with newborns. And this is quite ironic. It's probably the most chaotic time in families' lives and probably the least resource time. So cribs are expensive, so are car seats, so are diapers, and so is formula. And some of these items are covered by some programs, like the Women and Infant Children's programs, and maybe some smaller kind of home visiting programs, but there is no sort of federal policy that makes sure that children are born in families with at least some level playing field based on income. Some colleagues and I, so this was a pre-election. I don't know what's going to happen post-election. There was a whole Russell Sage volume that was recently published thinking about innovative anti-poverty policies. A group of my colleagues have really taken on this idea of a basic income for children, families with children, so a child allowance. And part of making the argument for this involves some simulations. So here's what we can do if we just give basic income to families, right? We can reduce the child poverty rate dramatically. And so these are various scenarios. One could argue we don't really know. It's going to be asked this question, well, how do you know income matters? And I am involved with the social experiment to actually test that precise question. If we give $400, nearly $400 a month to a family, a low-income family with a newborn, month to month predictable for the first 3 years of life, what do we see happening? What is done with that income? How does this enable families to invest in their home life, their family life, their environment? There might be surprising answers, but I think the point is we don't know, and this would be one opportunity to learn. The other component of my work that's been very interesting is to think about the mental drain of poverty. So it's a lot of hard work managing your finances, and it's harder when you don't know if they're coming in. And think about what else we're layering on these families. We expect them to fill out forms. We expect them to show up on time. We expect them to read to their children. We expect them to listen and understand and follow through with parenting lessons. We haven't thought about how we can make that aspect of family life a little bit easier, knowing that poverty not only comes with managing your money, but also managing how much mental capacity you have to devote to managing your money. And so there's some interesting work about how we can actually design our programs and policies to make life easier and more amenable and responsive to programs and policies. And so from that angle, it's really thinking about how that mental drain could be affecting things like take-up and show-up and failure to focus and be receptive and to follow through. So as wrap-up, the U.S. child poverty rates are sticky. Debates on the extent to which social assistance has helped, and the solutions depend on the political climate, but research evidence will transcend all of that. And so let's not drop the ball on research evidence. Let's continue to forge ahead. There's growing racial ethnic compositional shifts in poor children, majority non-white over time, experiencing extreme poverty and growing up in areas of concentrated poverty. And the last point, I think we can be smarter about translation of policy solutions to practice and thinking in a very fine-tuned way with evidence about how we design programs. I wanted to end on a quote that was pulled from Kathy Eden and Luke Schaefer's book, which was this combination of a huge quantitative effort and then a lot of deep time with 18 families. So And I think the theme, if Kathy were here, she would talk a lot about the dignity of being an American citizen and what's happened when you're poor. So Julie Wilkins, these are reflections. She's a former Mississippi teacher. Some of what struck both my husband and me the most were the nearly universal low expectations for behavior and academics, the crushing poverty, the way most everyone just figured this was how things were. And I think outside of all the good work happening here, altering that perspective on complacency, which is merited to some extent, is something that we can change and we should change. Thank you very much.